Hello, hello. Let's wait a few more seconds so that more people will be able to join the workshop. We are 17 now. So I will say welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining the workshop about publishing agreements. I'm very glad to have with me Elena Stan și Silviu Stratulat from Stratulat Attorney. So I will leave you with them. They will tell you more about themselves and what they are doing. And please use the chat and the Q&A session if you have any question for them. Silviu, please.
I'll pick it up from here. Andrea, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, and I thank everyone who registered for our workshop. I know that in a very stressful life of startup, and regardless of the area or regardless of the focus in the technology sector, including gaming, of course, the legal side of things might be overlooked just because they get left behind. And well, we are here to shed some light and try to explain to you and share a bit of our knowledge in relation to what we believe are principal topics. I will address a topic that deals generally or is of interest generally to startups, and then my colleague Elena Stan will touch base on publishing agreements and the perils and issues when negotiating with a publisher. Well, this being said, let me introduce myself. So I am the managing partner of a local but very international firm called Stratulat Albulescu, SAA. We have a very astute and well experienced technology practice, and which covers all of the areas of interest, including the gaming sector. My colleague Elena Stan, she's a managing associate with our IP practice. Of course, we couldn't have technology department in first place without the well-experienced IP lawyers that make up Elena's team, and also we cover many other areas of interest, including employment, including issues that deal or span far across whatever basically you're probably used to or have dealt with so far. Well, we're not here to definitely to speak about our capabilities or about the experience that we have in this field. I would like to start. We have reversed a bit the presentation, so I will start with my session, the session that deals with financing documentation, and then Elena will continue with her session that deals with publishing agreements, as mentioned. I would like to share a presentation that I've put together for today, and hopefully this will be helpful in guiding you through the issues that I will approach and touch today. All right, so the session is entitled "A Guide to Financing Documentation for Startups." Financings, any startup, regardless of the field, regardless of the sector, needs financing. It needs financing to develop, to promote, and sponsor, sustain the business, help scale it up to other geographical areas or in the same sector, boost its marketing, boost its development, and generally to make it more notorious and to give it a market share. So absolutely, financings are a key element to any startup or any business that would like to develop. And of course, they're not easy to obtain. They're not easy to close. Most of you have heard of financing rounds. We deal with financing rounds from all perspectives here in this session. We don't focus on venture capital funds, but of course, venture capitals are the most common investors nowadays. So we need to consider them, consider what they're used to in market practices, in what is the market practice in the financing that they will give out. So, entrepreneurs will be far better prepared if they understand the process, anticipate the deal terms and possible issues that will arise. And I think that, this is something that all of you should understand and be prepared for, regardless of the stage of your business, regardless of it being very, very early stage, or maybe later on, maybe well developed. You might still be in a position, or you might still at one point to just, run a financing round and just deal with that. The financing rounds can be very time consuming. It starts with meeting with the investors. You follow up with meetings and conversations and negotiations, followed by presentation, followed by other issues, and negotiating the term sheet. Continues with a due diligence, and finally with drafting and negotiating bylaws of the numerous legal documents to evidence and envisage the investment. I have divided my presentation sections. So the first one deals with what are term sheets, what are they used for, what are the principal terms that you would have contained in a term sheet, and what would be or should be of concern to you in relation to your rights and how you should protect your position in relation to the investors who you're negotiating with. And we've called it metaphorically demystifying the nature and purpose of key terminology and components of a venture capital term sheet. But again, it's not a VC term sheet; it's a term sheet, an investment term sheet in general, I would say. So we start by saying, what is So then we follow up with, the second section is, or the second main section is deals with shareholders agreements. How are they different by, as opposed to investment agreements, areas covered by shareholders agreements, and issues, each of those issues that should be, let's say, dealt with or regarded by you in relation to such a document. I would like to start with, with the term sheets. So what is a term sheet? Well, the purpose of a term sheet is to outline the deal in a concise document that could be of the investors and the company for approval. So, this document is just a summary of the main terms you will agree with the investors. It will, cover all the important facets of the financing, economic issues like valuation given to the company. The higher the valuation, the less dilution to the entrepreneur. Control issues such as makeup of board of directors, and all sorts of approval of veto rights that investors will enjoy in relation to decision making and resolution that you will have to pass in relation to your business. Also, post-closing rights of investors, such as right to participate in further financing rounds, and rights to get periodical financial information. It is basically a more condensed version of the final agreement, and it is used through the negotiations to develop the final agreement. Binding and non-binding nature, and I will run through very quickly through the main traits of a term sheet. This is the principal and primary trait of a term sheet, the binding or non-binding nature. So, typically a term sheet will state, and again, 99.9% of term sheets will state that they are not binding, except for certain provisions such as confidentiality and no shop or exclusivity, which are very important provisions where confidentiality, for instance, is something that you would definitely care for as much as the investor would. And no shop, which is exclusivity in relation to negotiations with one party, is something that the investor would care a lot for as well. So although it's document, what you need to understand is that whatever you agree in and goes in there will have to stay in there in case of in case the investment round goes forward, and in case you would start negotiating the investment documentation. So absolutely pay a lot of attention what you agree to include in the term sheets, and understand that it will be it's really not market standard. And it's really not, I would say, general for you to come back to the terms agreed in the term sheet. So pay a lot of attention and try to understand everything that is written in there, point by point, issue by issue. You could leave, of course, and this is a standard in terms of term sheets, the smaller issues and to the transaction documentation, to the financing documentation that will follow. So don't get into details, principles that are laid out in there, and understand how can you deal with that further. So, of course, I mentioned in the presentation as well that it's considered highly unprofessional and will likely, the investor would likely reject any kind of amendments post factum. Be very specific as possible. Some term sheets will, contain very specific terms. But you could refer to customary terms as well for ease of discussions, and we will get to that point, and I'll explain to you what customary terms might mean and how principles might be set out as well. And the conditions that will be laid out in the term sheet, not necessarily the term of investment, but the conditions to closing the financing could include, or should usually include, the negotiation and signing of actual documents and the due diligence, which, if you don't know what the due diligence means, it is an exercise, a review exercise where basically the advisors to the investors look, it could be legal, it could be tax, it could be IT due diligence, and they will look through the relevant aspects of your business and understand if there's a risk, if there's an issue, and any kind of specific issue that might cause damage to them, their position, or the company's position in future. So for instance, I don't know if, for instance, the intellectual property rights, which you should have or you should own, are not in reality owned by you, I mean the company, but are owned by your mother, for instance. It happens very often, or a distant cousin, and you haven't transferred those IP, the intellectual property rights, to the company, then that would be a red flag, that would be at least a flag that would need to be remedied before they would put money into the company. That's, for instance, one of the issues, legal issues, that could arise in a due diligence exercise. A critical part of the term sheet sets out who owns what and how much each shareholder gets if the company sells. So absolutely, valuation and percentages is an issue. Valuation is a valuation that many clients of ours, many startups, many founders ask me, how do you deal with valuations? Who sets the standards? How much can I ask for my company? And I always tell them it is a very tricky process and very tricky thing to deal with valuations, and to understand how much is your company valued. Are you, which stage are you in? You need to understand which stage are you in? What are the prospects for development? Absolutely the delivery by the team that is came up with the idea and is involved in the operations and the management of the company. All of that is very relevant, and you need to understand how to deal with that further on, early stage, but understand how you can sell that to the investors in the early stage, and deal with it further on, because you will need to deliver once you promise something. Valuations always, you need to understand two concepts: pre-money and post-money valuation. Pre-money valuation refers to the value of the company before receiving the funding. Post-money valuation is the estimated value of the company after receiving venture capital investment, or any kind of investment, I would say, not necessarily only venture capital. As I said, valuation is determined by many factors, such as industry competition, growth rate, traction, startup location, market, strength of the team, etc. Another very important provision in the term sheet, and I will go into, let's say, some technicalities here that I will also cover when speaking about the shareholders agreement, is liquidation preference. What are liquidation preference rights? So there are specific rights that are granted to an investor, including in relation to a liquidation of the business. So liquidation of the business is not per se a translation from Romanian language. We have, the word liquidation in Romania means something totally different, means winding up the company. But liquidation in the legal wider sense means sale of stock, so sale of the shares in the company 100%, or sale of business. So if this happens, once an investor will have put money into the company, they will expect priority in receiving the money that is obtained after the sale or in relation to the sale of the business, so which we call proceeds. So we would, if you have in mind, I mean, if your startup looks forward to, or expects a very modest exit, liquidation preference is very, very important and will greatly decrease the proceeds distributed to you as a founder. Of course, not an issue if you're going to be a unicorn, because if let's say an investor puts 1 million euro into you and expects to receive that 1 million euro with a preference, so before everyone else, but the sale proceeds are 1 billion, the million euro doesn't really count. But of course, if the business will sell for 2 million euros, then if they will receive 1 million euro before everyone else, then of course the founders, the pool that would be distributed to the founders would be greatly reduced. So understand very well what does a liquidation preference right means. There are several standards in the market: straight or non-participating preferred, cap participating preferred, or higher participating preferred. Each of them deal with what does the investor expect to get. Sometimes it is just that they want to get back their investment before all of the remaining proceeds will be distributed pro rata between all of the shareholders. So let's say ABC will own 30, and 40%. C is an investor. The total proceeds are 2 million euros. C will get 1 million euro, and then A, B, and C, including C, will divide the remaining million euro between themselves in the 30, 40% quota that make up their standard quotas to the share capital. So pay a lot of attention. Of course, this session is not meant to give you a lot of detail on concepts, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email us. We will definitely get back to you and answer all of your questions without any without any financial expectations and no strings attached. So reach out to us and we'll help you understand, or if you want to go in depth with any of these concepts, we'll make it more clear to you. Employee stock options. Employee stock options generally are very important for your business, and I would say that it's a concept and an institution that is relevant regardless of the financing rounds and regardless of any kind of financing initiative that you might have. They express a pool of shares reserved especially for employees, where startups cannot pay the wages that large global corporation or even a large local company could pay for talent. So we need to offer something else in addition to wage. And I think that what needs to be offered more often is stock. So in order to attract talent to a startup, you need to put up basically an incentive, and this incentive is stock in the company. The total pool usually ranges between 10 and 25%. The term sheet of an investment term sheet will basically specify a percentage of the post-money valuation that is dedicated to the employees who deserve and could be recruited, could be hired as lateral by offering them this stock. Yes, employee stock options are usually taken from founders, so founder stock. And the major topic, the major issue in a term sheet is what happened with the unissued or unvested options in the event of the sale of the company. So let's say you have a 20% pool, allocated for employees, and in future you decide to sell the company and you haven't managed to allocate or vest that 20%, that entire 20% to your employees, what happens to that stock? Well, that stock is interesting. Usually, investors will share the additional sales proceeds proportionally with the founders for that stock. So of course you can negotiate that. So let's say you haven't allocated the 10% and you have an investor in the company, you don't want to share the 10% with them, but you would like to negotiate in the term sheet that if this doesn't get allocated, you would be able to retain that 10% in case of the exit and collect the proceeds owned in relation to the 10%. All right, protective provisions. These are provisions which you will always come across in term sheets, and these are important because it protects investors' rights and it offers comfort, a certain degree of comfort to the investor. So we will go through this in the shareholder agreement session as part of the session as well, but the protective provisions mainly deal with anti-dilution. They can protect an investor in case of a down round. This is a lower valuation than they invested in a round that deals with an unfortunate of the business of the company. In case the company's valuation decrease from different rounds of financing, additional shares could be issued to the investor. And there are two standards in the market: full ratchet. Aware of it. Just try to battle any kind of full ratchet initiative by your investor, because it's definitely not going to be in your advantage. And of course, the second one is weighted average, which are the most common methods used for anti-dilution. In addition to this, try to understand how it works. Try to understand the mechanism, and maybe you could also apply it for other minority shareholders as well, which have been either angels to you and your business from the beginning, or maybe you wanted to attract and bring on board as consultants or members of the board, and so on and so forth. So anti-dilution could be applicable to them. So when you're negotiating a term sheet, keep that in mind, and keep them in mind as well, because of course they will not appreciate if they get diluted in a down run too. Right of first refusal and right of first offer. I mean, terms and things that deal with what happens. If you want to sell your stock. I mean, first of all, we will touch on this topic in the shareholders agreement section, but all investors will expect the founders to be locked up in their right to sell shares, sell stock for a number of years. It's usually anywhere between 2 and 4 years. So the founders will not be able to sell their stock, between 2 and 4 years, because investors will basically invest or are investing in you and are not investing in, let's say, the shell of the business itself. So what happens is that once this term lapses, so the 2 or 4 years, you'll have the right to sell, but the investor will want to have a right of first refusal. So if you have someone, a third party interested, and you want to sell it to them, you will approach them and say, I have an offer. I need to offer them to you first to see if you want to buy them, and then I'd be able to sell it to the other interested party. Right of first offer is just a general clause that requires any of the shareholder who wants to sell stock, in general, to purchase those shares before allowing any party to buy them. So this is even basically there's a very slight difference between right of first refusal and right of first offer. In the second type of institution, I would say that the shareholders would need to approach generally the other shareholders with the idea that you want to sell, and not necessarily with disclosed terms of sale that you've agreed with a third party. So the first one includes a third party that is interesting. The second one is just a general process that you need to follow in case you want to sell, right? I want to sell. I need you to make me an offer, and then I can freely sell. Of course, second one, right of first offer, is more advantageous to you as a founder to have in a term sheet and then later in the investment documentation rather than the first one. Then protective provisions, continuing the section. Exclusivity is very important. Founders agree to negotiate with the other investors, while the investors, which are parties to term sheet, agree that things get done within a reasonable period of time. So what this means, and there is a typo here, term sheets. So you would give them exclusivity in terms that you will give them the comfort that they're investing money in the due diligence at this stage. They're taking a lot of action, putting a lot of effort. At least you need to allow them the comfort that you're only negotiating with them and not negotiating with anyone else. Reserve matters. Voting rights and generally reserve matters deal with, the investor will want to have a say, will have to be involved in the decision-making process of your business. And the decision-making process means, resolutions which are passed by shareholders meetings or decisions of board of directors. So basically, they will insist in having provisions that protect them by giving them the right to block or veto certain actions. In Romania, this is not really achieved through, or principally not achieved through a veto right. So, the Romanian law does not regulate the right for a shareholder just to say no and oppose, and that's it. The resolution doesn't get passed, but higher thresholds, quite the opposite, higher thresholds for passing resolutions in shareholders meetings. So you would have an investor who owns 20%, then you need 81% to pass a certain resolution, and you would have an indirect vote veto by that. Without him, you wouldn't be able to pass positively the resolution, that respective resolution. So consent of the investors might be required to amend the bylaws, so the constitutive acts of the company, transfer the main business, alteration to the company's main asset, licensing companies IP outside the ordinary course of business, and others. Issuing stock options for new employees, change the number of directors, stake on debt, and so on and so forth. Okay, and moving forward, there are certain issues which are very relevant in negotiating term sheets. You could try to include terms that are not so investors could try to include terms that are not so funder friendly in term sheets. Extra protective provisions. So for instance, we discussed reserve matters and voting. They might want to extend that on very operational issues which exceed a normal threshold. That's an issue. You don't want that. You don't want to accept them mingling a lot with your operations, because it's in reality, at the end, you want to control your business and manage your business the way you want to ensure success, and hence basically their trust in you was based on the way that you handle and you manage your business. So it's very important. Full ratchet anti-dilution, we've spoken about. We already spoke about the two types of anti-dilution. Full ratchet can wipe out shareholders, including founders, in a down run. A down run again is when a company's valuation decreases in consecutive funding rounds. A broad-based weighted average, which is the second option, is the most founder-friendly form of anti-dilution, and it's followed by very narrow-based weighted average, which is basically something that can be negotiated and in this range with the investor. Multiple straight liquidation preference stock. This is I've listed the types of liquidation preference options that are available in there. Multiple straight means that the investor would be entitled to get paid their entire investment plus dividends and to a multiple amount of their original investment, so 2 times, 3 times multiple, et cetera, before the distribution of any proceeds of other shareholders. So you would guarantee a double or a triple of their investment. It's not very common in Romania, fortunately, but you might come across certain, similar terms if you have investors from all other parts of the world. All right, Q&A. Any questions? I haven't seen any questions. I just want to show everyone I have a t-shirt that is very uncommon for a lawyer, Andrea told me. So if you have any questions about my t-shirt, I'd be happy to answer. So term sheets, any questions? Andrea, maybe you have a question.
For now, but very interesting your presentation. I'm looking forward to see Elena's, and at the end, we'll see if we have questions. If not, I have some curiosities, but I don't want to ask you right now because I'm afraid they will sound a bit stupid. But
no, they won't. I'm sure they won't, actually. All right. So then I'll continue my presentation. Investment agreements. This is, I'm sorry. This should have been shareholders agreements. Presentation, always an issue. It's actually here. It should have been shareholders agreements. I'm sorry, I put this together very late last night. It's basically more attention now, less problems later. It applies to term sheets as well. So this is basically, shareholders agreements are an extensive version of the terms agreed under the term sheet. The ultimate purpose is to provide investors with rights above and beyond what it would have been by simple virtue of its overall percentage ownership in the company. So basically, if they would just be shareholders in the company, then the only document that would regulate and it will be compulsory, of course, would be our articles of association. The articles of association are different from a shareholders agreement in many aspects, and the principal one is basically articles of associations are public documents all over the world. They will go into public record. So if there are certain things that are specific that you don't want to disclose to the general public, then you would contain them in a separate document, and that document is the shareholders agreement. Of course, compliance to relevant companies law. I'm not even referring to Romanian law. Any kind of laws in general, articles of association will need to comply to that relevant state or law of a country. Shareholders agreements are not required under the law, and so they're private documents, private agreements between the parties. More swift is for breach in case non-observance of the provisions of the articles will be subject to specific remedies, unlike shareholders agreement, where the remedies are those limited by terms of the agreement or governing law. I'll explain this in just one sentence. If someone doesn't do what they're supposed to do under the shareholders, there's not much you can do immediately. So if they breach the shareholders agreement and they don't observe, for instance, the voting rules, then you can claim damages. You go to court. It will take 2 years. You might get some money off of them, but by then the business will be compromised. There will be an issue. Well, if someone breaches the articles of association, then whatever resolution, for instance, will result and will have not observed or breached, well, it could be annulled, so canceled by the state, by the court, state court in principle, in a matter of days or weeks. So not waiting, you're not going to be able to wait or have to wait for years for that. The content of the shareholders agreement is extensive, more extensive than the bylaws or the articles of association. It's the same thing, means the same thing. It's more shareholder focused rather than company focused. So, our articles of associations are company focused. Shareholders agreements are more shareholder focused. very important, something that you need to understand and keep in mind. How are they different from investment agreements? So, this is, here we come to a very, treacherous territory, because you need to understand that most of the agreements you will sign with the investors will be investment agreements and not shareholders agreements. But good news is that investment agreements are, in reality, shareholders agreements with a boost, right? So boosted, updated firmware, updated versions, as you like say in gaming, of the document. So an investment agreement will have, in addition to the shareholders agreement, a few clauses that outline the investment, how much, how and when, how in tranches, installments will be paid, and so on and so forth, and warranties to the investment, plus cap tables that would outline the structure of the share capital before and after, for instance, the investment. So that's very important, very interesting, generally, because I mean the concept of warranties is something that I wouldn't even want to go into, because it's so broad, and something that sometimes it's very, very closely related to due diligence and to what the investor understands and or wants to invest in, or has, what does he have an image that on in when he invests in something. So important. Areas covered by shareholders agreement. So shareholders agreement usually covers the issues related to share capital and transfer of shares, anti-dilution provisions, preemption, decision-making processes, management, dividends, exit, lever, restricted covenants. We will start with issues related to share capital and transfer of shares. Lockup. So as I was telling you, founders will be prohibited from selling their shares for a number of years, from accessing the investment. So these are, again, we're talking about shareholders agreements, which are broader documents, a lot more issues that to be regulated, or to deal with. And one of the issues is this, actually, lockup. And this is something that is not really negotiated. Will put in money because you are there, because of the management team, and because of execution. I mean, if execution isn't there, then the idea isn't really worth much. And they want you to be, or to remain committed. And you cannot be committed if you sell your stock, or if you sell your shares in the company. So they would want you there for a number of years. And it's 2-3 years normally, but it could be even 4, depending on, the business plan that you presented them with, and, the business itself, and the segment, and so on and so forth. And then, the employee stock option shares are excluded from lockup, usually because, of course, you need to transfer them to the employees. But they will, the employees, once they get their shares, they will too be locked up for a number of years as well, because that is one of the prerequisites for them getting shares, commitment to the company, and this is why they're getting to be a part of them. Put options. Put option is not a very important or not so important term, but it is important for you to understand what it is about. So if things go wrong, if your company doesn't really do well or perform well, then the investors will not really want to be involved in whatever happens after not going well. So insolvency, maybe something else. I'm sorry to be bringing up such a negative topic, but still. So because they are not interested in that, they will want to have an easy way out. And the easy way out usually is their right to sell you the shares for nothing, for 1 year, or par value, nominal value. This is the most common. So they will sell you the shares just because venture capital fund has a lifespan, for instance. Venture capitals are one of the investors. They're not all the investors, one of them type of investor, but they have a lifespan. They need to 7 to 10 years, and they don't want to have the shareholding there on their balance sheets, and this might prohibit them from closing. So if they're not sure they can sell in profit, then at one point in time they will sell this to you at nominal value, at par value. Anti-dilution provisions, we've covered this already in the section that dealt with term sheets. down rounds and protected price and weighted average and full ratchet. I mean, these are the things you need to care and understand about. You can find loads of information about them on the internet. We would be happy to answer any of your questions and understand or provide more clarity in relation to these issues as well. Preference for disposal of shares, the right of first refusal and right of first tender. It's actually a right of first offer here. I'm sorry. And so it's right of preemption the sale of shares, and then all of the other rights which we've covered already in the term sheet, or when dealt with, we dealt with the term sheet generally. Play close attention if there are large number of shareholders, because there is a risk of economic deadlock, and it's an issue basically, because you will fragment a lot the share capital if you have a preference right by many shareholders who acquire your shares. Then it might get further divided in between them, and so on and so forth. Decision making and the management of the company, corporate governance. So we've covered this as well in term sheet, but just to summarize what we've discussed, they might have direct or indirect control, veto a special majority on major decisions which are material to the existence of the company. The investor usually acquires minority ownership, but will need or require control over material decisions. So agree on all the issues subject to veto right in the term sheet, and carefully review the possibility, the materiality thresholds from the perspective of the business of the company, because it's very relevant to you. So don't let them get in the operations too much, because they will interfere, and it's not something that you want. You don't want investors interfering in the company. Then management. Choice of management structure is very important, because it involves a lot of interesting developments later on. In Romania, we have a choice. I mean, probably many of you don't even know, but we have a choice between the standard board of directors structure or more complex structure, which was always understood as the complicated one, but it's not really complicated, and it provides a lot of comfort to the representative that sits or should have sat on the board. That is the two-tier system with a supervisory board. Supervisory board has limited liability as opposed to the full board. So this two-tier management system is starting to be more and more common among startups, even though again they're not huge companies with huge management structures, but still. Nevertheless, the board of directors are the most common form of management. The investor will always want to have one designated board member who sits on the board. Material resolutions, even by the board, will be subject to qualified majority or unanimity. Dividends, and investors will generally oppose the distribution of dividends, because they will want to keep as much liquidity in the company as possible. You, on the other hand, your source of income is maybe the salary that you take from the company, but you don't want to burden up the company too much with the social contributions and state budget contributions. So your salary would probably not be very high. So you might rely a lot on dividends, basically, just to get on with your life and have support your needs. So try to negotiate with them a certain percentage of the profit that could be distributed in dividends, at least year 2, year 3, year 4. Drag along and tag along exit provisions. These may come up in this may come up in the term sheet negotiations as well. It's actually these are very relevant sometimes, because they deal with how can I me as an investor, how can I determine the sale of 100% of a company to a third party, even if I hold 30% or 20%. Well, I can only do that if I have the right to drag with me the other shareholders, including the founders. So an investor will usually want to have this right, because it will say, I might have a buyer in year 3 or year 4 of my investment that is interested to acquire the entire business, but he wouldn't buy 20%, he would buy 100%. So then I would have drag along rights. So to drag the other shareholders, they would sell with me at the same price, right? Of course, liquidation preference provisions will be applicable, but still they would have the obligation to sell. So this is basically the drag along right, and tag along is quite the opposite. I'm a shareholder who can be dragged by another shareholder, but he wants to sell. He does not drag me because he thinks that he can sell 30%, maybe for more money than he will sell 100%. But then I have the right to say, no, you cannot do that. You need to, I want to sell as well, and I need to sell with you. Okay, so that's important. Liquidation preference, we're not going to go through that another time because time is limited, and we went through that once before in term sheets. Lever provisions, yeah, lever provisions are, this is where fists get made by the parties, and bad words are said sometimes in the negotiations, because what is lever provision? So the as I said, an investor invests in the business, but invest in you as founders, in you as managers, and it's very important. And this is, let's say, important for everyone, any investor, angel, venture capital. What happens if you leave? What happens if you quit tomorrow? You say you want to go and live in Bora Bora, and become a bartender in Maui, or just go and surf in Hawaii. So you don't want to continue, or you just want a different lifestyle. Well, in that case, the lever provisions, what they say is that if you quit, you forfeit your shares. So you transfer the shares for €1 to allegedly €1. The mechanism is much more complex and complicated, but I would say you give away your shares. If you want to leave, you cannot leave, right? You have to give. I mean, you're committed to the business. You have to be committed. So this is a bad lever. So this could also be fraud. You've stolen from the company. You breached. You've treated people badly, and you did something wrong. Maybe you were convicted for a criminal offense, and so on and so forth. I mean, all sorts of these events could be a bad lever. And so if you're a bad lever, then you have to sell your shares for no consideration whatsoever. What happens if you're incapacitated, or God forbid, you die? Well, then you're a good lever, and your family, or you, in case you're incapacitated, should get a fair valuation, or the compensation equal to a fair valuation of the shares that you held before that. And this is tricky to negotiate. Get a lawyer. Just get a lawyer. I mean, I couldn't advise anything else. It's difficult. It's difficult. It's broad. It could be takes many shapes and forms and issues. Information rights. The investor needs to be informed. Absolutely, needs to understand what's happening with your company. It needs to understand the evolution, results. So they will have and also they might have investors of their own, if they're institutional or if they're venture capitals, investors of their own, who would want to see what happens with the portfolio of investment. How much money are you making, how are you developing, and so on and so forth. Important.
Silviu, sorry to interrupt. Your screen sharing stopped. I'm not sure why. But
I'm sorry.
We cannot see your presentation anymore.
I'm sorry. Yeah. How about now? Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Perfect.
Technology sometimes is difficult. Yeah, so restrictive covenants. I'm sorry for before. We will share this presentation with all of you. Andrea will help us with that. Restrictive covenants, non-compete, non-solicitation, non-poaching undertakings. All of these are undertakings that will impact you. Very important. Will impact you even after you exit the company in any way, right? So non-compete is important because he needs to understand gaming, for instance. If you're going to go do your thing in the gaming sector in another business, then you might be prohibited from doing that if you sell your business. So you need to understand what kind of games, for instance, am I developing currently? What kind of games am I being able to develop after the business ends? So all of this is very important to negotiate, and geography-wise as well. Can I go work in the Czech Republic and develop a game in Czech Republic, or can I do it in the US or Australia once I've sold the business or once I've exited the business? So all of this are important. Q&A. We have one question, which is I'm very excited. So let me read it through. Yeah, that's good question. So what happens if we're approached by an investor and we have to spend a lot of money to negotiate the contracts, but the deal doesn't get done? That's an issue. Well, this is why you need to be, it's not common for the investor to cover your costs as well, unless they pull out of the deal. So if they pull out of the deal and they negotiate in bad faith, then they should cover your costs. Otherwise, if just negotiations fail because you haven't really managed to reach an understanding, an agreement over certain terms, then it's not common for them to pay the legal costs. However, the way you can deal with this, and the way you can prevent you from incurring significant costs, is to try to negotiate very well the term sheet and understand how the term sheet, your rights under the term sheet. Negotiating of term sheet, it should not be a burdensome, should not be a costly process. And any lawyer that asks you for a lot of money or any money at all and I'll explain to you any money at all as well, you might have to reconsider working with that lawyer. And because why? Well, the prospect of that party, the lawyer working throughout the transaction should be a sufficient incentive for him to help you in the term sheet, for him to get engaged by you in the process later on. So try to get, I'm not supporting free advice generally, but here, if part of a larger deal, then you could, of course, try to agree on free advice. So term sheets are important. If the term sheets are well negotiated, think about this. The investor will incur a lot of money in the due diligence process. And usually that means something in the range of 20 to 55,000 or 60,000 euros just for the due diligence. It could be 15 altogether if you're a very small target. I don't think that they will be very happy for negotiations to fail after they've spent that much money. So, that is, due diligence comes before the extensive shareholders agreement or investment documentation, or, whatever share purchase agreement if you want to sell your company. So, they will have incurred a lot of money before those documents get negotiated, right? So try to focus on term sheet and understanding the principle of the business. And again, it's very different if you're negotiating a term sheet for an investment. It's very different to a term sheet for a sale, or a partial or a buyout, which is a full sale. Those are different terms, and it's another story if you're negotiating a sale. Absolutely. If there's any thing that, let's say, expands from your question, ask me. You can write it here, and I'll develop this further.
Now I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, how do I get to live in Bora Bora? Obviously, with the purpose of developing a game over there.
Well, not becoming a lawyer, that's for sure.
Okay, good to know. Anyway,
that's for sure.
It's a bit too late for that. No, but I really do have a question. So in general, smaller studios, when dealing with publisher, have a very weak negotiation power. What should they keep in mind, and what are the things they should not compromise on?
The terms they should not compromise on. you know, I mean, I think that the main issues deal with how much power will you give to an investor in relation to the operations of the company. I mean, you don't really want to have them mingle with day-to-day operations. So, you know, I mean, even a board of directors, I mean, they would appoint someone, but most of decisions that deal with day-to-day operations should be decided on by you, or you know, the people who represent you and your interest in the board. So I would say that this is a major issue in relation to the investor. Also, a second very important thing is what happens in case of an exit. You know, the liquidation preference rights. Those are always tricky. And you know, bit by bit, you would be able to negotiate your way through the liquidation preference. And the standard in the market right now, because it's a very startup-driven market in Romania. I think that, you know, right now it's nothing to do, or has nothing to do with the international standards, but are lower for investors. So, you know, liquidation preference, for instance, in the United States means I put in €1 million. I want to get $1 million, right? I want to get $1 million, and then everything that remains will be divided in between myself and the other shareholders. In Romania, for instance, the venture capital funds put in $1 million, and when they get out the higher of either the 1 million or whatever would be owed to them if the division in percentage
would apply. So that's it. They don't get. It's not a step,
right? It's not a preferred quota distribution. So they don't get the million and then everything gets divided, but they get either the million or whatever is higher. You know, if the stake is higher than whatever is higher the stake. So this is it. I hope this is, you know, I mean, these are the main principal issues in relation to those. I don't know. You know, there are a number of other smaller issues like the lever and so on and so forth. But again, we would go into so much detail now that I think we need at least another 3 hours. I think I had a session in a tech accelerator program online seminar 2 weeks ago, and it was a 3.5 hour session. And at the end of the 3.5 hour session, apart from having, you know, losing my breath entirely, I had another half of the presentation not covered. So, you know, you could go on and on for almost forever in dealing with these things. But I think that you know, Elena, my very astute and very nice colleagues should pick up and should try to you know, shed some light over the perils of publishing agreements.
Yes. Hello, everyone. We are very happy you registered to our workshop, and we would like to draw your attention to a number of issues involved with publishing agreements, and that's why we entitled our presentation "Publishing Agreements: A Pitfall Hunting for Game Developers." Because sometimes it really does feel like you are hunting for traps and pitfalls. And our goal is to make you understand that the publishing agreement should be seen as a whole, but also in the context of the commercial situation you are entering with in the collaboration, but also pay attention, perhaps close attention, to some contractual clauses that might be extremely onerous for you or might limit your future projects. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see my presentation. Okay. I searched a lot for a representative image, so so I can convey the message properly, and I found this image from Half-Life. Hopefully it's representative enough. So what we will be discussing during this presentation revolves around mainly the IP in the game. So who actually owns or controls the core IP is an issue that should be assessed properly. Later on, eyes on the prize. Look at the legal implications of video game development. The third chapter is related to remuneration of the game developer. So advances, royalties, and revenue share, if the case, hopefully so. And later, post-release contractual obligations and the Q&A. So although publishing agreements have been around for a while, at the moment there is no industry standard video game development agreement. As the development process is very complex and lengthy and expensive, it involves a lot of creative personalities as well as programmers, developers. So the context is quite complex and should be considered each time you enter a new venture, a new project. For example, console games take years to develop. They require a very, very large team, a big budget. For example, GTA 5 took almost 5 years and 115 million to develop, with a further 150 million spent on marketing. Mobile games, on the other hand, are usually involve a quick development process, a smaller team, and a budget of over $1 million. It depends on the case, of course. So when developing a video game, various creations, various works integrated or created for the video game are subject to specific legislation, such as copyright legislation, trademark legislation, trade secret legislation, and sometimes even patent legislation. But that one is a bit tricky, as we will discuss later on. So the music, the code, the storyline, the characters, the art, box design for console games, and the website design is usually protected under copyright legislation. Trade secrets refer to customer mailing lists, pricing information, publisher contacts, developer contracts, development tools, terms for deals. So anything that you can integrate under this definition should be done so in relation to the publisher, but also when dealing with your own employees and collaborators. You can also register as a trademark the company name, the company logo, and the game title, if of course the game title is your own creation. Under patent law, it's quite difficult to obtain legal protection here in Romania because the authority, the State Office for Inventions and Trademarks, our OSIN, is very restrictive when it comes to grant patents, especially for software. So if you have plans to register some of this technology, other jurisdictions such as the US jurisdiction would be more suitable. In other jurisdictions as well, you can also patent inventive gameplay, even design elements, technical innovations, and a network and database design. So when dealing with development agreement, there are two key issues that will shape the agreement as a whole, and that should be considered by the publisher as well as the developer when negotiating and agreeing the clauses that make up the agreement. The main question that has to be addressed is which contracting party actually owns or controls the core IP. And the second question is who is financing. So is the publisher going to finance the project, or is the developer going to take Silviu's advice from the presentation before and try to obtain some financing through its own means? With regard to IP ownership, in most cases, the game will be based on IP that is either owned or controlled by the publisher. So either the game is based on an existing game and the developer is contracted to create a new version of that existing game, for example, a PC version of a console game. And this is usually referred to as porting. Either the new game is based on an existing game series or a franchise, and this is sometimes owned, sometimes licensed by the publisher, or the game is based on an entirely new concept. This splits also into two situations. The new concept is either created by the publisher or created by the developer. In most cases, the budget issue is handled by the publisher. Of course, it depends on the case, but from what we have seen so far, for example, mobile games are usually funded by the developer, and console games almost exclusively. So if the game is an original concept and belongs to the developer, you, as the developer, will have to finance the project early on in order to obtain an MVP, so a minimum viable product, in order to actually attract publishers, would have to be created on your own resources. So keep in mind that you have various options like crowdfunding platforms or external investors or a lot of means to obtain funding if this is something you have your mindset on. So depending on the points discussed on the previous slide, so IP ownership and funding, there are two types of development agreements currently being implemented. So we have work for hire agreements and original product agreements. The first one is, in Romanian, it's called Opera la Comandă under our copyright law. This is the title used. In this type of agreement, the publisher owns or controls the IP and is financing the development. So the developer will have to assign all the IP in the game, and most generally, he will be paid a fixed amount without royalty participation in the commercial exploitation of the game. This is not a rule, this is just a general practice, as we observed during our work. Original product agreements, they regulate a new game, particularly where the concept has been created by the developer. If this is the case, it is usual for the developer to retain some or all resulting IP. This depends very much on the negotiation position that you start on as the developer. So if you have some funding or can somewhat fund your own activity and do not depend exclusively on the publisher, this will create the best context for you to negotiate and retain your IP. This is important as not for this specific project exclusively, but also for future endeavors you might consider. So if you want to create a game and maybe later create some reskins and market the game as the same basic concept or the same architecture or structure, but actually create new characters and new graphic, new design. This will not be blocked by the publishing agreement, which we will later find out sometimes is the case. As we mentioned before, the legal implications of a video game are quite important, even though developers tend to be focused on the project itself. on the workflow, on the deadlines, and not focus as much on legal terms or some clauses that maybe appear strictly theoretical, like something like this will never happen and this clause will never be activated. So we would like to urge you to consider a more focused review of this type of clauses. As we said, the video game development is a very complex software project, so it's mainly writing a lot of code, but not just that, because it requires project management skills and techniques necessary for any significant software development project. Also, as it is a creative project, it involves dealing with artists, with the writers, artists, actors, and musicians. So it's extremely complex. Okay, to get into the agreement per se, we would like to start by maybe presenting a few terminology and the general workflow that we noticed usually is implemented between the publisher and the developer. So the notion of game or title is a high-level reference to the relevant game. For example, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare. The product or version notion represents the version of the specific version of the game that is subject to that publishing agreement. So if a publisher comes to you and requests an Xbox One version of a specific game, the publishing agreement will most likely use the terminology of product or version. Platform is referring to the particular hardware device for which the game is being developed, for example, the PS4 or the Xbox One. And besides such terminology, the publishing agreement usually contains general references to services that are to be expected from the developer. So defining what it is to be developed is essential. Typically, a publishing agreement will also contain an annex called the schedule that will set out milestones for the development of the game. It is very important to expressly provide dates by which each milestone is to be achieved, as well as deliverables that should accompany each milestone. So each time you achieve a milestone, you will most likely have to deliver these deliverables to the publisher. During the normal workflow, after delivery, the publisher will have the right to review all deliverables and require any error correction if the case. It is extremely important that the notion of errors is well defined, and we recommend inserting only objective criteria to which the publisher should refer to when informing the developer that there is an error. So in addition to proper definition of this notion, we also recommend to provide a clear time frame within which the publisher will have to review each deliverable and inform the developer on errors. This is important because depending on their acceptance, the next installment of the advance will probably be paid to the developer. So you have to have a clear contractual framework with a definition of errors, the time frame in which the developer has the chance to review and provide feedback, as well as how much detail should an error the publisher provide, because you don't want your team, your employees to start scavenger hunt if they receive a general notification like this month's deliverables contain errors. There should be more indications and details so your team can properly address the issues, correct errors, and ensure the next installment will be paid on time. The final approval is applicable to console games. So if you are developing a game for a specific console owner, most likely they will have the right to approve or refuse the game that you have developed. Okay, so the source code. This is essential and should be properly defined, as the publisher normally requires the developer to provide a complete drop of whole source code with each deliverable. This is not a rule. If you are in a stronger bargaining position, for example, if you have financing and if you own some or all the IP, you might be able to refuse this type of contractual provision or get the publisher to agree on an ESCO arrangement. So we so far discussed all the obligations the developer has. Well, let's see what the publisher should do under the development agreement. So usually the developer needs the publisher to provide various materials, services, and other types of support, such as hardware. If you are developing a game for a specific console, you will have to receive from the publisher the development kits. This is standard practice. You will also have to receive various materials relating to the IP on which the game is based. For example, if the game is based on a franchise or movie, for example, you will receive the scripts for that movie, most likely for a limited amount of time. And you will have to sign a very restrictive NDA, which it's normal, of course, to sign this type of non-disclosure agreements. Our recommendation is for you to implement the same confidentiality obligations in relation to your employees and your collaborators. So keep in mind that breaching such an NDA will have serious consequences, and usually penalty clauses are huge penalty clauses are associated with such a breach. In addition to hardware and materials related to the IP of the game, usually the publisher is the one who provides localization services, such as the translation of in-game text. If you as the developer will be required to do something like this, for example, ensure translation of the in-game texts, the dialogue between the character or something, you should make sure that this is properly reflected in the fees that you are going to be paid. Okay, so this is a source object, as we have observed during our work with different players in the gaming industry. So most developers don't pay enough attention to post-release obligations and focus on the on deliveries, on the release date, on the success of the game, and they get swooped up on this very exciting project, but sometimes neglect the post-release obligations. So please consider exactly what will be required from you as the game developer after the release of the game. For example, error correction. You can expect to be required to provide patches to correct game errors for usually 6 to 12 months after the release of the game. You can implement general provisions in the publishing agreement governing the manner in which these types of errors will be categorized and the different levels of importance with different resolutions or response times. So if you have a non-important error like I don't know, some small glitch that is not even noticeable, maybe the response time can be a bit longer. But if the error is crucial and the game cannot operate, then the response time should be a lot shorter. Live support, this one is quite tricky as it does raise a lot of issues. Firstly, we would like to advise you to consider dividing the responsibilities between you and the publisher. So as much as possible, try to select some of the live support services and not undertake the entirety of this customer service aspect. You should consider the size of your live team and associated costs. If you will need to extend your team or appoint certain employees solely to live support, this could very well damage your focus for different projects and could affect your activity. The level of support that will be provided is another issue. So try to expressly provide the hours of operation and response times. The procedure for increasing and decreasing the size of the live team is also an issue that publishers always regulate in publishing agreements. So you will most likely have some provisions governing this type of matters, such as how you can terminate for convenience one of your key employees, or how you can recruit other team members that will be appointed to the publisher's specific project. Also, please keep in mind that if you provide live support, this implies a lot of data privacy implications. So if you process data as part of the live support obligations that you undertook under the publishing agreement, you will most likely act as a data processor under the GDPR. So you will have to sign an annex to the publishing agreement governing how you will process data on behalf of the publisher, as well as a data transfer agreement, which has become increasingly challenging after the validation of the privacy shield. So if you will transfer data to the publisher, most likely headquartered in the US, then please make sure to properly integrate the standard contractual clauses for cross-border data transfer as issued by the European Commission. Another post-release obligation is to provide downloadable content and additional levels in the game. This doesn't have to be specifically regulated at the beginning of the contractual relationship, but we do advise implementing a contractual mechanism that will allow you to agree with the publisher what will be developed in later stages and the additional costs related to this. All post-contractual obligations should be subject to additional fees, different fees than those paid by the publisher initially. So it most likely will not fall under the advance that was paid for the development of the game. We will discuss remuneration issues very, very soon. Okay, so as we know, you will start a publishing agreement with your own know-how, your own expertise, and Most developers incorporate some of their proprietary tools and techniques into the game. And of course, as it is reasonable, you will want to use these tools and technologies for future projects. So please keep in mind that you don't have to assign all the intellectual property rights over your own tools and technologies to the publisher. So legal phrasing is of utmost importance in this case. Don't assign your own IP. Grant a limited license, a non-exclusive license to the publisher. Okay, and you will also most likely use some third-party technology, either to create assets for the game, such as artwork, or actually incorporate third-party software into the game, at least in part. So what you should do is pay very close attention to licensing agreements, because all of the third-party software, including open source software, is governed by a specific license, and you should observe the terms and conditions before incorporating into the game. If you don't do this, the main risk is that you will not be able to comply with the contractual obligation provided by the publishing agreement. So maybe the licensing agreements will not allow you to comply with your own contractual obligations. Specific clauses of the publishing agreement are option clauses, which are extremely tricky and should be carefully considered when negotiating and signing a publishing agreement. So generally, the publisher will want to have the option to publish any additional games that the developer will subsequently create, especially, of course, if they're based on or associated with the current game. As mentioned, this is referred to as porting, so this would be an example of a port. Also add-ons like additional content or additional levels of play, as well as sequels. This is a normal clause, but should be carefully reviewed before signing the agreement. So let's take our two scenarios. One, the developer retains the IP in the game. That is the ideal scenario. I hope you will be in a lot of scenarios like this and be able to secure your intellectual property rights and use them in future projects as well. So the key issue is to assess if the option clause is a first look option or a matching right option. So the first look provides the publisher with the right of first negotiation, and the second option, the matching right, provides the publisher to review and match any competing offer. The problem with the existing of matching right option is that you will have a very hard time negotiating with another publisher if you are bound by one of these clauses. If you are under this clause with the current publisher you are working with in your current project, discussing future projects with another publisher will be surely affected by this type of clause. So please ensure that this type of option does not conflict with any rights that you have granted or may need to grant to a different publisher. In the scenario that the publisher owns the IP in the game, the developer may want a first right of negotiation in respect to any port, add-on, or sequel relating to the game. So if the publisher owns the concept and the IP, it is in your interest as a developer to have this type of clause in the publishing agreement, so you could be considered for the next related project. Another clause that we see has been neglected by when reviewed by developers is the term of the agreement. It's usually not properly assessed, as it seems like a general clause, so it's really clear and simple why analyze and assess possible scenarios and think about what could happen. Well, it's typically a number of years, and it's very important to have clear provision regulating the time when it starts. So from what point is the term calculated? Is the signing date, or is it about the occurrence of a later event? So if we have the final acceptance by the platform owner, for example, when you develop a console game, or the commercial release of a game, you have to be clear on when the agreement actually starts. So no matter the mechanism and the start date, we recommend implementing a long stop date in case the relevant event never occurs. For example, you can have market shifts, you can have different things happen. A competing game could be launched before the game that is subject to this publishing agreement, and the publisher can decide to postpone the release date. So if that happens, you will be bound by this agreement. So implement a long stop date, for example, a specific date, like 1st of January 2024, in case you will need to exit the agreement. You should have a specific date in place. Also, when terminating the publishing agreement, you should also consider if all of the license rights should continue for the full length of the term. Usually this will be very difficult to negotiate with the publisher, but for example, the right to grant sublicenses could be limited to a shorter period. It's worth a try, at least to negotiate. Okay, so another specific clause related to the publishing agreement is the marketing clause. As you very well know, marketing is essential for a game's success, and there are a lot of stories in the industry of amazing games that did quite poorly due to bad marketing, and on the other hand, really bad games that did quite okay due to strong marketing. So it's not sufficient for the publishing agreement to provide that the publisher will use its best efforts or its reasonable endeavors to market and promote the game. We strongly suggest that this be supplemented. For example, provide a minimum amount that the publisher would spend on marketing the game. This would be a guarantee for you that the publisher is serious about this project, and the game will receive the best shot it can possibly get from a marketing perspective, at least. Also, carefully regulate what counts as spend for this purpose. So internal costs or overheads of the publisher should not count as marketing costs. So inserting a definition in the marketing clause should ensure this type of behavior will not be implemented by the publisher. Also, if at all possible, again, an ideal situation, hopefully it will be your case, why not? You should regulate the developer's ability to review and maybe make suggestions on the publisher marketing plans. you will not obtain a clause providing that the developer had to approve the marketing plan, so that's excluded. But maybe you can review, you can make suggestions depending on the relationship with the publisher. Again, I think it is of utmost importance. It's crucial for your leverage, for your negotiating position, if you can provide part of the funding yourself. If you can, you're not as vulnerable to negotiate with the publisher. Also, you should contractually regulate credits. You, of course, would want to ensure that your firm, as the developer, will be shown on the game's credits. For console games, this might be an issue as the platform owners usually have final approval on credits and have very, very restrictive rules in relation to this. Okay, so money talks. Finally, we get to the financial aspects of the publishing relationship. So traditionally, the game development process is substantially funded by publishers. However, an increasing number of developers fund projects themselves through various ways, like listing on a crowdfunding platform or self-publishing and external investments. We can definitely say we have seen this. The developer is clearly in a much stronger position when it comes to negotiating royalty rates as well as the agreement as a whole, and starts discussions with the publisher from a different position. So the advance is payable by the publisher as a way to finance the development. The advance is paid in installments upon successful completion of the agreed upon milestones. So you should be very careful to provide the time periods within which each milestone should be reviewed. As mentioned before, the publisher should have a period of time in which to review and revert to the developer with any notifications on errors. Okay, so the basis for the publisher to withhold approval of a milestone is also very important. Exclude any subjective criteria and properly regulate this under this agreement to ensure that the advance installments will be paid on time. Usually, developers somewhat depend on these installments being paid on fixed date in order to pay their employees, their contractors, and all the operational costs. So in order to avoid any discussions, any frustrations, any type of blockage in the development process, you should be careful to contractually regulate all these aspects from the get-go. Also, process and time periods for the developer to remedy these defects and resubmit the corrected milestone. This should also be part of the agreement. So even though it is called an advance, it's actually a non-refundable payment on the account of royalties that may become payable by the publisher to the developer. The payment structure is quite complex, and you have to be mindful of various notions and really try to grasp the meaning of each term used in the contractual chapter relating to fees and payment. So the minimum guarantee provides the developer with some assurance that the publisher will meet its obligations to market and promote the game. The publisher will undertake to invest a fixed amount, a minimum fixed amount, in order to ensure the game has the best chance it can possibly have. When calculating royalties that are due to the developer, they are made in reference to two terms: gross receipts and net receipts. So maybe these could be considered the most important definitions from the publishing agreement. So gross receipts means all of the relevant income from the game, regardless of source. And net receipts sets out the deductions that the publisher can make from the gross receipts in order to. Usually, these two terms are properly defined, and they are also containing some examples of what could represent income sources, as well as what could represent deductions under the publishing agreement. So please make sure these are properly defined, and some examples are provided in the publishing agreement. You cannot be sure if the royalties will actually become payable under the agreement. It depends on how much money the game is going to make, how many expenses the publisher is going to have. You don't know. But you can have these provisions in place, and if the case, they will be activated. If not, then at least you did all your diligence. So in order to ensure that you are paid the royalties and the revenue share that is contractually owed to you, you should have an additional clause on audits. This ensures that the publisher has an obligation to maintain books of accounting sufficient to enable each royalty statement to be checked. You will also have to contractually implement the ability of the developer to audit these books on a periodical, for example, usually it's a quarterly basis. So on a periodical basis, you would have the right to audit the publisher's books. Another chapter that is usually, I don't know, treated lightly, let's say, and not actually neglected, but not reviewed as much as it should be. Let's say it like that. So the chapter regarding termination, you will surely have a clause of termination, and this enables the publisher to terminate the agreement at any time before the final acceptance of the game. This may seem like it's not fair, but actually changes in the market or the launch of a competing game, as I previously mentioned, could adversely affect the commercial prospects of this game. So the key aspect to assess here is what will be the amount paid to you as the developer if the publisher decides to terminate for convenience. Usually this is the payment is the installment applicable to the milestone that you are currently working on, as well as one or two installments of the advance. So that's market practice. This is, as everything else in the agreement, subject to negotiation, depending on what you can offer and what you can leverage in these discussions. Together with the termination, we always advise you try to implement a clause regulating the reversion of rights. So rights that are no longer exploited by the publisher within a specified time frame should revert to the developer. If you are not using those rights, then the developer should have them back. We have seen some clauses like this, but most publishing agreements don't contain them, as publishers don't usually accept this type of provision. Also, ensure that the operation of the game and all the post-release obligations that are incumbent to you could be transferred, either to the publisher or to a third party, perhaps. So don't be stuck after termination with post-release obligations, and especially in the worst case scenario where you are not even paid properly for providing those post-release services. Also, you can try to implement a clause requesting that the publisher be required to return codes, assets, and other materials relating to the game. Some other additional clauses that you should be aware of refer to key persons, subcontracting, no poaching, representations and warranties, and insurance. I will take a quick look to see if we have questions. So I see we don't have any questions at the moment. Just to know how long I can speak on this additional clauses. So key persons, this is related to your key employees. The most important developers in your team should be communicated to the publisher, and most likely the publisher will have in place some contractual clauses governing the way you will manage this talent. So termination for convenience in relation to key persons will not be possible, or termination for convenience in relation to such individuals will be subject to the publisher's prior approval. Also, recruiting could be contractually regulated under the publishing agreement, so pay close attention to that as well. Subcontracting refers to your ability as the developer to outsource some of the works for the development project. So maybe some less important works, such as secondary artwork, could be outsourced, and you would have to have a subcontracting clause in the agreement allowing you to do this. No poaching. So the publisher will get to know your team quite well. Your key persons will be in contact with the publisher's team, and he could try to recruit some of your personnel. So including a non-poaching clause could protect you from this type of situation. Representations and warranties. It depends on a case-by-case basis on what this contractual chapter actually entails, but usually the developer warrants that it owns all the IP that is being assigned under the publishing agreement. What I can tell you for sure is that most developers do not own all the IP that is being assigned through the publishing agreement, because they don't ensure that they have obtained all the IP rights from the individuals who are actually creating the game. So from developers who are writing the code, from artists who are designing the graphics, the characters, everything. You have to ensure to contractually regulate the assignment of IP rights from all the employees and collaborators involved in the development process to your company. This is the only way you can actually guarantee that you will comply with your obligation towards the publisher. So you cannot assign rights that you don't have. And if you have, and you will surely have, representations and warranties clause, then you will not be able to comply with them, and maybe pay some penalties under the agreement. So make sure you obtain all IP from employees and collaborators. Another additional clause that is problematic is that referring to insurance. So most publishers request an insurance policy of somewhere between $1 and $5–10 million, which is not just unrealistic, but it's impossible to obtain by developers, for example, by Romanian companies who are operating as game developers. It's impossible to provide such an insurance policy under the agreement. So our advice in relation to insurance clauses is to review them together with your insurance broker. Just contact an insurance broker and discuss it before signing. Okay, so if you have any questions.
I might have one for you.
Okay.
So thank you very much for your presentation. The question is regarding the IP indeed. So when it comes to IP transfer, tell me if there is a common paragraph, like a straightforward, that can be used in every contract signed with collaborators on the project. So I'm building a game and I will need artists, sound designers, and so on. So
under Romanian legislation, you have to be extremely careful. For example, in relation to your employees, if they are developers, our legislation provides that the IP is automatically vested in the employer. However, this is referring to some of the works created by them. Because of our legislation is not updated and is not in line with current market needs, you cannot, the definition is computer programs. So obviously there are a lot of elements created during development that fall outside the scope of this definition. For example, all design elements are outside this computer program notion, and user experience and user interface related works also fall outside this definition. So in relation to employees, you should implement a clause governing works that exceed this notion. And in relation to third parties, you will have to govern the IP assignment in relation to any and all works. So to answer your questions, you could use very broad definition and a very broad clause that could be applicable to all of these scenarios. Our legislation imposes 4 validity conditions. So keep in mind the rights that are being transferred, the territory, the type of the assignment, if it's exclusive, non-exclusive, and modalities of use of the rights, and also, most important, the remuneration. So you could have, in theory, a clause that could work in all scenarios, but it's best to try and adapt general legal provisions and contractual clauses to the specific of the agreement.
I understand. Thank you.
I think you have a question.
Yes, yes.
Of course you can. Of course, we would love to assist you.
Yes, and as you already know, the other speakers of Dev.Play are on Discord, and they are still replying to questions from the participants. But as I know that you are not there, I will kindly ask the participants to this workshop if they have any question for you afterwards. Just send me an email, and I will forward it to you, and you will take it from there.
Of
If
course.
you have time.
And as Silviu mentioned, we will of course send you the presentation so you can have at least a minimum amount of information needed to deal with this publishing agreement situation.
Yes, I believe that your presentation is very useful, and
I
I
hope
really,
so.
really enjoyed.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. So before ending the workshop, please, can you tell me the most three important things that we should leave this workshop with regarding the IP? If there can be three general things.
Three general things related to IP. Try to contractually secure the IP, sign agreements with your employees, with your collaborators. The second one is try to register your IP if at all possible. For example, software platforms, anything can be registered with the Romanian Copyright Office. So maybe keep in mind that official proceedings related to registration could be extremely useful. Register your trademark, register your domain name. Of course, this is already done. And try to protect your rights as much as possible through registration as well as contractually. And the third would be to keep in mind that the IP is your greatest, most important asset. And when negotiating, this should be the most important thing to consider. So maybe pricing is less important than the IP, because after this particular development project, you could start a new one. And you should have the entirety of the intellectual property rights over all your works, and not assign them as easily as we've seen some developers do.
Yes, I'm sure you did. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
It was very nice to have you at Dev.Play, and I think very useful for the participants.
Very nice to be here. Hopefully we will meet again really soon.
Yes, hopefully. And I want to thanks also to all the participants that stay with us till the end of the workshop, and wish you all a very nice evening.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bine.